Everyone's heard of the M1 Carbine. Most people have seen one in a museum, a movie, a video game. It shows up everywhere. Black and white photos from the Pacific, color footage from Korea, grainy newsreel clips from the streets of European cities in 1944 and 1945. It's one of the most recognizable weapons of the 20th century, and yet for decades it was one of the most dismissed. Soldiers called it underpowered. Historians called it a compromise. Critics called it a solution to a problem nobody really had. Some went further and called it outright useless in a real fight. But here's the thing. Over 15 million of them were built. More than any other American small arm in the entire Second World War. More than the M1 Garand. More than the Thompson submachine gun. More than the 1911 pistol. More than any of them. And the men who carried it, the clerks and the radio men and the medics and the officers and the engineers who were handed this little rifle instead of something bigger, most of them came to love it. Not because they were told to. Not because they had no choice. But because, in the world they actually lived in, this little carbine made sense in ways the critics never bothered to understand. If you want to know the real story of the M1 carbine, not the oversimplified verdict written by people who never had to carry a weapon through a jungle for 6 months, then stick around. Because this is the gun that was called useless, carried by millions, and turned into one of the most beloved firearms in American military history. And before we go any further, if you want more stories like this one, weapons that were misunderstood, underestimated, or just flat out fascinating, hit subscribe right now. We put out this kind of content every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Let's go back to 1938. The United States Army is looking at its personnel structure and realizing something uncomfortable. There are a lot of soldiers in the military who are not frontline infantrymen. There are truck drivers, signal corps operators, artillery crews, headquarters staff, medics, engineers, quartermasters, and all of these people are required to carry some kind of personal weapon, because in war, the front line has a way of becoming fluid, and even the guy fixing radio equipment behind the lines might need to defend himself someday. The problem is, the weapons available at the time are not particularly suited to these soldiers. The M1 Garand is a magnificent rifle. Nobody disputes that. 8 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition, semi-automatic fire, robust and reliable, and accurate at ranges most combat actually occurs at. But it's also heavy, over 9.5 pounds unloaded. It's long, nearly 4.5 feet from butt to muzzle, and it requires a fair amount of training and practice to use well. For a frontline rifleman whose entire job is to close with and destroy the enemy, that's perfectly reasonable. But for the guy whose job is to drive a supply truck, or operate a field telephone, or bandage wounds under fire, carrying a rifle that heavy, while also doing their primary job, is a genuine burden. The 1911 pistol is the other option, and it has even more problems in this context. It's short range, it holds only 7 rounds, it takes real skill to shoot accurately under stress, and the stopping power of the .45 ACP cartridge, while genuinely impressive at bad breath distances, drops off dramatically beyond about 50 yards. If your job is to defend yourself in a sudden emergency and then get back to your primary task, the pistol feels inadequate. So the Army starts asking a question. Is there something in between? A weapon lighter than a rifle, more capable than a pistol? Something a non-combat soldier could carry all day without it interfering with their work, but pick up and use effectively if they found themselves in trouble? This is the problem the M1 Carbine was designed to solve. Not replace the rifle, not replace the pistol entirely. Fill the gap between them for the people who needed something in between. That sounds reasonable. That sounds like sensible logistics. And for a very long time, a lot of people thought it was reasonable, right up until they saw the carbine perform in combat and decided that it wasn't enough. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about how this thing came to be, because the development story is one of the strangest and most impressive in American military history. In 1940, the Army issued a request for what it called a light rifle. The specifications were demanding in their own way, not for power, but for lightness and handiness. The new weapon had to weigh no more than 5 pounds. It had to use a semi-automatic action. It had to be accurate enough to hit a man-sized target at 300 yards. And it had to be chambered for a cartridge that didn't exist yet. Winchester was contracted to develop the new cartridge alongside whatever weapon ended up winning the competition. The cartridge that came out of this process was the .30 caliber M1 carbine round, officially the .30 Carbine. And this is where the controversy begins, because this cartridge is noticeably less powerful than either the 30 caliber M1 or the 30-06 Springfield rounds used in the Garand and the standard machine guns of the era. It's a short, stubby cartridge, closer in energy to a pistol round than a full rifle round, though significantly more powerful than the most common pistol cartridges of the day. The 30 carbine fires a 110-grain bullet at around 1900 feet per second. That gives it a muzzle energy of roughly 900 foot-pounds. Compare that to the 30-06 at around 2,800 foot-pounds, and you can see why critics called it inadequate. You're looking at roughly one-third the energy of the standard American rifle cartridge. Even the 30 caliber M1 carbine rounds' more powerful siblings look at it with something like pity. But energy numbers on paper are not the whole story, and the people who wrote off the carbine on that basis alone were missing the point of what the weapon was supposed to do and who it was supposed to do it for. Meanwhile, 11 manufacturers were competing to produce the winning rifle design, and the front-runners at first were mostly established gun-making firms: Winchester, Springfield Armory, Inland Manufacturing. They all submitted designs. But the surprise entry, the one nobody saw coming, came from a company that had never made a military rifle in its life. Winchester's submission came partly from a man named David Marshall Williams, known to history as Carbine Williams, a genuinely extraordinary character with a genuinely complicated past. Williams had developed a short-stroke piston gas operation system while serving time in a North Carolina prison farm for a bootlegging-related killing, a detail so strange that Hollywood eventually made a movie about it. His gas system, which used a tiny amount of propellant gas tapped from the barrel to cycle the action, was brilliantly simple and robust. But the actual rifle submitted by Winchester was a team effort, with contributions from Williams, Fred Humiston, and William Romer, among others. The design they produced was elegant, simple, easy to manufacture, easy to maintain. And when the Army held its competitive trials in May of 1941, the Winchester submission outperformed almost everything else in the field. The testing was brutal. Thousands of rounds fired. Dirt introduced into the action. Rain, heat, cold. The Winchester design handled it all with remarkable reliability. It won the competition and was standardized as the United States Carbine, caliber .30, M1, in September of 1941. 3 months later, Pearl Harbor. And suddenly the military needed this weapon in enormous quantities, immediately. What happened next was a manufacturing miracle. The Army didn't want just one or two producers. It wanted everyone it could find. Inland Manufacturing, which was a division of General Motors, became the largest producer of M1 carbines during the war, eventually building over 2.5 million of them. But alongside Inland, you had Winchester, who produced just under 800,000. You had Underwood Typewriter Company, which switched from making typewriters to making carbines and built over 600,000. IBM, which was not yet the technology giant it would become, produced over 300,000. Irwin Pedersen made theirs. Rockola, which made jukeboxes, made carbines. Standard Products, Saginaw Steering Gear, National Postal Meter, Quality Hardware and Machine Corporation. Companies that had never made a firearm in their lives were tooling up and producing functional military rifles in the middle of a world war, and producing them well. The total production run by the end of the war exceeded 6 million carbines during the war itself, and the final total counting post-war production runs from all manufacturers crossed 15 million. That number is almost incomprehensible. It means the M1 carbine was produced in greater quantities than almost any other shoulder-fired weapon in American history, and yet somehow it spent decades being called a failure. Let's talk about what the carbine actually felt like to carry, because this is where the critics and the men who carried it start to see things very differently. The M1 carbine weighs 5.5 pounds loaded with a 15-round magazine. For reference, the M1 Garand weighs 9.5 pounds. The Thompson submachine gun weighs over 10 pounds and is even more awkward to carry. The carbine is short, under 3.5 feet overall. It sits comfortably against the body, doesn't catch on vegetation, doesn't slam against your hip when you're trying to climb into a vehicle or through a window. It has a simple push-button safety that you can operate with the thumb of your firing hand without breaking your grip. The magazine release is similarly intuitive. The sights are better than almost anything else available to American forces at the time, adjustable for both windage and elevation, a rarity in 1941. For the soldiers it was designed for, it was a revelation. A radio man could sling it across his back and actually use his hands to carry and operate equipment. A medic could wear it on a harness that didn't get in the way of treating casualties. An officer could carry it instead of a pistol and actually have a fighting chance if his command post was overrun. A Jeep driver could stuff it under the seat and reach it in a hurry. These are not trivial advantages. These are the differences between life and death in a sudden ambush. And then there were the paratroopers. The airborne forces took to the M1 carbine with particular enthusiasm, and this led to one of the most important variants of the weapon. The M1A1 carbine, produced specifically for airborne use, featured a folding wire stock that collapsed alongside the receiver, making the weapon short enough to fit inside a kit bag or strap to a leg without hanging up in the aircraft door during a jump. The folding stock was not beloved for its shooting qualities. It was admittedly less stable than the wooden stock, but as a practical solution to the problem of jumping out of an airplane with a rifle, it worked. Paratroopers carried them at Normandy, at Market Garden, at the Battle of the Bulge. They were in the hands of the men who jumped into Sicily and Salerno. The carbine also had one more variant that would prove even more important in the long run. The M2 carbine was a selective fire version, capable of fully automatic fire at a cyclic rate of around 700 to 900 rounds per minute. Combined with a new 30-round curved magazine that replaced the original 15-round box, the M2 gave rear-echelon troops and eventually frontline soldiers a weapon with genuine close-range firepower. The M2 wouldn't be fully fielded until late in the war in Europe and would see more action in Korea, but its existence showed that the carbine family was capable of evolving, adapting, and meeting new tactical needs. Now we have to talk about the Pacific, because that's where the M1 carbine's reputation took its most serious damage, and the story there is genuinely complicated. Fighting in the Pacific was unlike anything in Europe. The terrain was dense jungle, thick vegetation, poor visibility, extreme heat, and humidity that punished both men and equipment. And the enemy was the Imperial Japanese Army, soldiers of extraordinary tenacity and determination, who were often fighting under conditions of fanatical loyalty that meant they kept coming long after a Western soldier might have stopped. Drug-fueled charges, bonsai attacks, desperate nighttime rushes through the jungle, Japanese soldiers stitched to trees with wounds that should have killed them continuing to fire. And it was in this context that American soldiers, many of them armed with M1 carbines, started noticing something troubling. Sometimes, the carbine didn't seem to stop a man as quickly as it should. A soldier hit by a .30 caliber carbine round sometimes kept moving, sometimes kept fighting, not always, not even most of the time. But enough times that the men carrying the weapon started talking, and the stories spread, and eventually the conclusion hardened in certain quarters that the carbine was underpowered and unreliable as a man-stopper in the worst situations. These complaints were real. The men who made them were not exaggerating. What's more complicated is the full picture of what was actually happening. The .30 caliber carbine round was not designed to be equivalent to the .30-06. It was never supposed to be. It was a middle ground cartridge for a middle ground weapon. At close ranges, inside 100 yards, it delivered meaningful energy to a target. But the Pacific fighting sometimes involved soldiers heavily bundled in clothing, or already wounded and still advancing on adrenaline, or hit in a location that didn't immediately incapacitate them. The carbine's relatively modest muzzle energy meant that a non-central hit was less likely to put someone down immediately. This is true. This is also true of many other weapons, including the .30-06 in certain circumstances. A non-central hit anywhere on the body with most rifle cartridges will not necessarily result in immediate incapacitation. The difference with the carbine was that the margin for error was smaller. With less energy, you needed a better hit to get the same result. But here's what the critics of the carbine rarely discuss. The soldiers who most frequently complained about it in the Pacific were often soldiers who had gotten hold of a carbine instead of their issue weapon. Frontline infantrymen who wanted a lighter weapon sometimes traded for carbines or picked them up from casualties. These men were using the carbine in roles it wasn't designed for. They were taking it into the kind of sustained rifle combat that the Garand was built to handle. Of course, it came up short in that context. It wasn't supposed to be a Garand replacement for frontline infantry. The rear-echelon soldiers who it was actually designed for, the men who might need to defend themselves in an emergency but whose primary job was something else, those soldiers very rarely had complaints. Because when a supply depot was attacked, or a headquarters unit found Japanese infiltrators in the wire, or a medical company was overrun, the M1 carbine in the hands of a non-rifleman performed exactly as intended. It gave that person a fighting chance they would not have had with a pistol, and they could handle it well enough in a crisis without the months of intensive marksmanship training that the Garand rewarded. The European theater told a somewhat different story, and it's important to understand why. In Europe, the typical combat environment was less uniform than the Pacific. There were wide-open fields in France, rubbled city streets in Germany, mountain valleys in Italy, forest fighting in the Ardennes. The ranges varied enormously, and in Europe, the M1 carbine developed a genuinely positive reputation among many of the soldiers who carried it. Paratroopers at Normandy landed in the dark with their weapons and found the compact carbine manageable in the chaos of scattered drops and hedgerow fighting. Headquarters personnel who suddenly found themselves in the path of the German breakthrough during the Battle of the Bulge were grateful to have something more capable than a pistol. Tank crews who used carbines as their personal defense weapons appreciated the size advantage enormously. Artillery crews working their guns under sporadic infantry attack found that the carbine's manageable size and recoil made it practical to pick up and use in the brief windows when they weren't serving their guns. And even some frontline infantrymen came around to the weapon, particularly in the urban fighting that characterized so much of the Italian campaign and the push into Germany itself. In a city, ranges are short. Firefights happen inside of 50 yards. The carbine's accuracy at those distances was entirely adequate, and its rate of fire in semi-automatic, combined with the 30-round magazine once the M2 became available, gave it genuine utility. There's a story that circulates among historians of the period about a battalion commander in Europe who refused to give up his M1 carbine for any other weapon, even when offered a Garand or a Thompson. He had qualified expert with it. He trusted it, and in the environments he operated in, he felt it was the best personal weapon available to him. He was not unique. There were thousands of soldiers like him. This gets to something important about the carbine that its critics consistently undervalue. Personal confidence in a weapon is not a trivial thing. A soldier who trains with a weapon, who becomes familiar with its feel and its quirks and its capabilities, who trusts it in the dark, performs better with that weapon than with a theoretically superior alternative he's less confident in. The M1 carbine's mild recoil, its simple operation, its lightweight, all made it a weapon that secondary troops could actually train on effectively and actually become competent with. That competence mattered. Competence under fire matters more than caliber on paper. The Korean War brought the M1 carbine back into frontline service in ways that the original designers probably never intended, and it was in Korea that the weapon's limitations became most acute and most visible to the public record. In Korea, fighting conditions could be brutal in a particular way. The winters were severe, and this created a problem that nobody had fully anticipated. The M1 carbine's gas-operated action was sensitive to extreme cold in a way that the M1 Garand's action was not. In very cold temperatures, the lubricants in the carbine's gas system would thicken or even freeze, slowing or stopping the cycling of the action and producing malfunctions at the worst possible moments. Soldiers fighting in Korea during the winter of 1950 and 1951, the period that included the Chosin Reservoir Campaign and the Chinese intervention, reported carbine malfunctions in the bitter cold that were genuinely dangerous. The weapon that was supposed to give rear-echelon troops a fighting chance was in some cases leaving them with a single shot before the action failed to cycle. This was a real and serious problem. It was also, to be fair, a problem that affected multiple weapons in those conditions. Cold weather lubrication was an issue across the board, and some of the carbine's problems were later traced to improper lubricants being used, rather than any inherent flaw in the design. But the perception stuck. Korea added another layer to the carbine's reputation as inadequate, particularly after Chinese infantry began appearing in large numbers, and the fighting became savage and close quarters in a way that put enormous pressure on everything the Americans had. And yet, even in Korea, there were soldiers who swore by the carbine. Medical personnel, signal operators, support troops of every kind, officers who carried it and found it entirely sufficient for their needs. The weapon was not universal in its performance, partly because the conditions it was used in varied so enormously, and partly because it was increasingly being asked to do things it was never designed to do. The M2 selective fire carbine also saw significant use in Korea, and in the close quarters fighting that characterized much of the conflict, the ability to switch to automatic fire and dump a 30-round magazine at short range gave the weapon a role that its critics hadn't anticipated. At 20 yards in the dark, an M2 carbine with a 30-round magazine is not a trivial defensive weapon. It is a genuinely dangerous thing to be on the wrong side of. After Korea, the M1 carbine faded from frontline American service relatively quickly as the military transitioned to the M14 and later the M16. But it didn't disappear from history, it spread around the world. American military aid programs distributed carbines to allied nations in enormous numbers. South Korea received millions. Taiwan, South Vietnam, the Philippines, Israel, which used them extensively in the 1948 War of Independence and continued using them for years afterward. France, Germany, Italy, Greece, Japan, where the Self-Defense Force received carbines as part of the American occupation's military assistance program. The carbine became a kind of global footnote to American military power projection. In Vietnam, the M1 and M2 carbine appeared in the hands of South Vietnamese army soldiers and regional force militia. The smaller frame of the average Vietnamese soldier made the carbine's dimensions more suitable than the Garand or even the early M14, and for a time, the carbine was considered a reasonable option for certain ARVN units. It would eventually be replaced by the M16, which was lighter and more powerful, but for years, the carbine continued to serve in Vietnamese hands. In Israel, the M1 carbine acquired an almost legendary status. Israeli soldiers used it in 1948, 1956, and into the 1967 war. The Israelis were pragmatic about weapons in a way that cut through most of the theoretical debates. They had limited resources. They used what worked, and in their hands, the carbine worked well enough in the environments they were fighting in, often at close ranges in urban settings or in the rocky terrain of the Middle East. They eventually developed their own modifications and used Israeli-produced ammunition that sometimes addressed some of the ballistic criticisms by using heavier projectiles. The carbine lasted in Israeli service longer than most people realize. But the real testament to the M1 carbine's lasting appeal is not its military service. It's what happened to it after the military was done with it. Millions of M1 carbines entered the civilian market after the Second World War, both through surplus sales and through the civilian marksmanship program, which sold rifles to American civilians at very low prices as part of a program to encourage marksmanship among the population. And civilians discovered something about the carbine that the military records had somewhat obscured. It was a genuinely pleasant rifle to shoot. The .30 caliber carbine cartridge produces almost no felt recoil. The weapon is light enough that even smaller frame shooters can handle it comfortably. The action is smooth and reliable under normal conditions. The sights are good, the ergonomics are excellent, and there is something undeniably appealing about the way the weapon looks and feels. It has the lines of a weapon designed when people still thought about aesthetics alongside function. The straight stock, the pistol grip, the short handguard, the simple barrel bands. It looks right in a way that is difficult to quantify and impossible to deny. American civilians bought them up enthusiastically. They used them for deer hunting, which was controversial since the cartridge was borderline for deer at any real range but acceptable for close shots. They used them for home defense. They used them for target shooting. They shot them at ranges and gun clubs and in competitive marksmanship events, and they talked about them. There is a continuous thread of affection for the M1 carbine in American gun culture that has never really gone away, spanning from the 1950s all the way to today. You can walk into a gun store right now and find M1 carbines on the wall, and people who will talk about them with genuine enthusiasm. New production M1 carbines are still being made. Companies like Auto Ordnance and Inland Manufacturing, yes, the same name as the wartime producer, have produced modern versions of the original design for civilian buyers who want the experience of the original weapon with new parts and modern quality control. The ammunition is still commercially available. The magazines are still being made. Parts kits are still produced. 70+ years after the weapon was designed, the M1 carbine remains in active production and active use. That doesn't happen to useless weapons. Let's talk about some of the individual stories, because the numbers and the statistics only tell you so much. The real story of the M1 carbine is in the hands of the people who carried it. There's the story of the army nurses and medical personnel who found themselves armed with carbines when Japanese forces overran their positions on Bataan and Corregidor. They were not trained infantry. They were medical professionals who had never expected to be in combat. The carbine's simplicity and lightweight meant that even people with minimal weapons training could operate it without intensive practice. In the chaos of those terrible early months of the Pacific War, that simplicity mattered enormously. There are the stories of Signal Corps soldiers in Europe who strapped carbines to their backs and climbed telephone poles to restore communications under fire. A Garand strapped to a lineman is a problem. A carbine is merely an inconvenience. The difference between those two things could be the difference between communications being restored or not. There are the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions who landed at Normandy with M1A1 folding stock carbines and fought with them through the hedgerow country of Normandy. One officer of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, a unit made famous by their role in the Normandy campaign, was reported to have used his carbine to lead his stick of paratroopers through the initial chaos of the scattered drop, accounting for several enemy soldiers at close range before linking up with friendly forces. The weapon's compactness made it practical to use while still managing the chaos of a scattered airborne operation in the dark. There are the stories from the Battle of the Bulge, when headquarters units and service troops suddenly found themselves in the path of the German armored breakthrough and had to fight. These were cooks, supply clerks, MPs, signal troops. They had carbines. And in the confusion and horror of those December days in Belgium and Luxembourg, they used them. They were not fighting at 500 yards across open fields. They were fighting at crossroads and in villages, and in the snow at distances where a carbine was entirely adequate, and they held long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The fact that they had something more than pistols mattered. There's a particular account from the defense of Bastogne that occasionally surfaces in memoirs and historical accounts, describing supply troops armed primarily with carbines who helped hold a section of the perimeter against German infantry, probing for weak points. They were not elite soldiers. They were not trained as infantrymen, but they had practiced with their carbines, they knew how to use them, and they performed when it counted. Nobody called the carbine useless that night. And then there's the entire category of officers who chose the carbine over both the pistol and the Garand. Officers in the American military in the Second World War were expected to lead, and leading meant being visible. And being visible with a rifle created a tactical problem because it marked you clearly as a person worth shooting first. Some officers favored the Thompson for its firepower in close situations, but the Thompson was heavy and loud and had limited range. The carbine gave officers a weapon light enough to carry while moving their units around, accurate enough to actually use at moderate ranges, and capable enough to defend themselves if their position was rushed. Many officers who got to choose their personal weapon chose the carbine, and they didn't choose it because they were misinformed. They chose it because it fit their needs. Let's take a moment to address the cold weather malfunction issue in Korea directly, because it deserves more than a brief mention, and it also deserves some context that the simple narrative often leaves out. The winter of 1950 was extraordinarily severe, even by Korean standards. Temperatures at the Chosin Reservoir dropped to 30 and 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. That is not a temperature range that any weapon of that era was fully optimized for. The M1 Garand also experienced malfunctions in those conditions, though it was generally more tolerant of extreme cold than the carbine. The M1911 pistol also had issues. Even the Browning automatic rifle, one of the most reliable weapons in the American inventory, could be temperamental in extreme cold. The carbine was more sensitive than most because its short-stroke gas piston system relied on very specific timing and pressure that could be disrupted by thick, cold lubricants. The solution that was eventually developed was relatively simple. Use very thin lubricant in cold weather, essentially run the weapon almost dry rather than with a normal lubricant application. This approach largely solved the cold weather cycling problem, but the solution came too late for many of the soldiers who suffered through the worst of the 1950 winter campaign. In subsequent cold weather fighting, American and Allied soldiers who had been briefed on proper cold weather maintenance for the carbine generally experienced much better reliability. The weapon was not fundamentally broken. It needed specific maintenance procedures that were not always well known or well communicated in the early part of the Korean conflict. That's a training and doctrine failure as much as a weapon failure, and it's important to distinguish between the two. There's also the question of the .30 caliber carbine cartridge's performance, and whether it was as inadequate as its harshest critics claimed. This is a question that firearms researchers and historians have revisited repeatedly over the decades, and the picture that emerges is considerably more nuanced than the simple verdict of underpowered. The .30 caliber carbine round delivers approximately 900 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. At 50 yards, it's delivering something like 800 foot-pounds. At 100 yards, roughly 700 foot-pounds. These numbers are well above what any standard pistol cartridge delivers. The .45 ACP, which the Thompson fired and which was considered a serious man-stopper, delivers around 350 to 400 foot-pounds at the muzzle and loses energy quickly. The .30 carbine has significantly more energy and significantly better range. The issue with the .30 carbine round was not raw energy, so much as bullet construction and design. The full metal jacket projectile required by the Hague Convention, the same rule that governed most military ammunition of the era, did not expand on impact. It was designed to punch through cleanly, which from a wound ballistics perspective is less immediately incapacitating than a projectile that expands and transfers more energy to the target. At typical engagement distances, a full metal jacket .30 caliber carbine bullet would often pass through a target without transferring all of its available energy, resulting in a wound that, while serious, was not always immediately incapacitating. This is the same issue that affected all full metal jacket ammunition of the period, but it was more noticeable with the carbine because there was less energy to start with. With the Garand's 30-06, even a pass-through wound transferred enormous energy. With the carbine's .30 round, a pass-through wound at the periphery of the body could be survivable in the short term. Had the .30 carbine round been developed with a soft point or hollow point projectile, the kind available for civilian use today in that caliber, the wound ballistics picture would look considerably different. Modern commercial ammunition in .30 carbine, using expanding projectiles, is a genuinely effective personal defense round. But in military use during the Second World War and Korea, the troops had what they had, and what they had was a non-expanding bullet that did what non-expanding bullets do. This context matters because it means the carbine's stopping power problems were not entirely inherent to the weapon or even the cartridge. They were partly a function of ammunition design choices that affected all military small arms of the era, but hit the lower energy carbine hardest. Now let's talk about something that rarely gets mentioned in the standard histories. The M1 carbine's production story is not just a military story, it's an industrial story, and as an industrial story, it's one of the most remarkable achievements of American manufacturing in the entire Second World War. Getting 15 manufacturers who had never built military rifles to produce a complex firearm to tight tolerances, with full interchangeability of parts between manufacturers, in quantities that reached hundreds of thousands per month, is an extraordinary logistics and engineering achievement. The parts from an inland carbine had to fit and function in a Rockola carbine and a Winchester carbine without any fitting or modification. That requirement meant extremely precise manufacturing standards and very tight quality control, all being maintained simultaneously across a large and diverse group of producers who were learning as they went. The fact that this succeeded, that M1 carbines from different manufacturers were genuinely interchangeable, that they could be disassembled in the field and the parts from multiple weapons combined to make functioning rifles, is a testament to American industrial capability and to the engineers and managers who made it work. It was not guaranteed to succeed. Early in the program, there were significant quality control problems at several manufacturers that required intense effort to correct, but they were corrected and the system worked. The weapon that came out of this process was not perfect. No weapon is perfect, but it was reliable enough, accurate enough, handy enough, and manufacturable in sufficient numbers to arm millions of American soldiers and give them something useful to carry. Given the demands placed on American industry in 1941 through 1945, that outcome is something to respect rather than dismiss. There's another dimension to the M1 carbine story that deserves attention, which is the role of women in its development and testing. The Army's original specification called for a weapon that could be operated effectively by soldiers with less extensive training and less physical strength than a frontline infantryman. One of the informal tests conducted during the evaluation process involved having soldiers from support and headquarters units handle and fire the competing designs. Some accounts suggest that Women's Army Corps personnel were also involved in handling evaluations, partly because the WAC represented exactly the kind of secondary military personnel the weapon was intended to serve. The carbine's lightweight, mild recoil, and intuitive controls scored consistently well in these evaluations. The people who were actually going to carry the weapon found it comfortable and manageable. That feedback mattered to the selection process, and should matter to any honest assessment of the weapon's fitness for purpose. The M1 carbine's post-war civilian life brought one more chapter that cemented its place in American cultural memory. The Korean War era and the early Cold War period saw the civilian marksmanship program distribute large numbers of surplus carbines to American civilians at nominal cost. These weapons flooded into American homes, where they were used for hunting, target shooting, and home defense. Many American men of a certain generation had their first serious introduction to rifle ownership through an M1 carbine acquired through the CMP or purchased cheaply through a hardware store or sporting goods shop. Those men passed their carbines to their sons and daughters. The weapons became family heirlooms. They were stored in closets and handed down at estate sales and retrieved from barns and attics across the country. They connect people alive today to the war that their fathers or grandfathers fought in a tangible, physical way that photographs and medals cannot quite replicate. When you hold an M1 carbine that was manufactured in 1943 by Underwood Typewriter Company in Illinois, you are holding something that might have been carried by a supply sergeant in Normandy, or a paratrooper in Holland, or a signals officer somewhere in the Pacific. That connection is real, and it means something. There's also the matter of the carbine's role in popular culture, which has been continuous and remarkably consistent across 8 decades. The M1 carbine appears in virtually every depiction of the Second World War in American film and television. It's in the hands of soldiers in Band of Brothers. It shows up in the Pacific. It appears in film after film set in the Korean War. Because it was so widely distributed, it appears in period photographs constantly, in the background of press shots, in the hands of off-duty soldiers, in headquarters photos, in liberation scenes across Europe and the Pacific. It is one of the visual signatures of American military power in the mid-20th century. And because it appears in so many photographs and films, it has become familiar to generations who were born long after the last M1 carbine was issued to a soldier. People recognize it, they find it appealing, they seek it out. The result is a weapon that has maintained genuine commercial relevance for longer than almost any other firearm design of the Second World War era, which is a remarkable thing for a weapon that was supposedly useless. Let's also address the variants beyond the M1A1 and M2, because the carbine family was more diverse than most people realize. There was the M3 carbine, which was an M2 fitted with an infrared night vision scope, the sniper scope or snooper scope system, for nighttime operations. This was one of the earliest tactical night vision systems fielded by any military in history, and the M1 carbine was the platform chosen to carry it. The combination was used in the Pacific in the closing stages of the war, and later in Korea. The idea that a weapon supposedly too underpowered to be useful was simultaneously being developed as the platform for cutting-edge night vision technology is a tension that the standard critical narrative never quite accounts for. There was extensive experimentation with suppressors fitted to carbines. The weapon's relatively short barrel and the characteristics of the .30 carbine cartridge made it a reasonable candidate for suppressor use in certain special operations contexts, and while this never resulted in widespread fielding, it represents another avenue of development that doesn't fit the simple, useless weapon narrative. The M4 designation was briefly applied to a version with a shorter barrel intended for use from armored vehicles, though this version was not widely fielded and shouldn't be confused with the later M4 carbine, which is a completely different weapon in a completely different caliber. What all of this development activity suggests is that the military found the carbine useful enough in a variety of specialized roles that it continued to invest in expanding its capabilities. You don't develop night vision variants and suppressor programs for weapons you've decided are worthless. Let's take stock of where we are. The M1 carbine was designed to fill a specific role. It was meant to give non-combat soldiers a weapon that was lighter than a rifle and more capable than a pistol. It succeeded at that role by almost every objective measure. It was light, it was reliable under normal conditions. It was accurate at ranges that covered most of the situations its intended users would face. It could be operated with minimal training by people whose primary job was not fighting. It was produced in enormous quantities by an industrial base that had never made rifles before, and the people it was designed for, by and large, came to like it. Its failures were real, but specific. It was less effective than a full-power rifle at extended ranges. Its stopping power at the margins of a hit was less impressive than heavier cartridges. Its gas system was sensitive to extreme cold in ways that caused problems in Korea before proper maintenance procedures were established. These are genuine criticisms of a weapon that genuinely had limitations. But the verdict of useless that attached itself to the carbine was not an honest assessment of the weapon as designed. It was the result of frontline infantrymen using a rear-echelon weapon in frontline roles, experiencing its limitations in those contexts, and allowing their understandable frustration to become the dominant narrative. It was the result of the Pacific Theater's particular brutality imposing demands on the weapon that exceeded what it was built to handle. It was the result of cold weather maintenance failures that were as much a doctrine problem as a weapons problem. The M1 carbine was not the best weapon for the frontline rifleman.